You are listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast featuring some of Indiana's most fascinating men and women whose impact has shaped our state, our communities, and us. Join us as we discuss their imprint on our history. Leaders and Legends is brought to you by Veteran Strategies Incorporated, your local veteran business enterprise specializing in public relations, media relations, public outreach, crisis communications, and digital photography. My name is Robert Bain, Principal of Veteran Strategies, former Deputy Chief of Staff to Mayor Greg Ballard, and Communications Director for the Indiana Republican Party. I'm honored to be your host for our discussion. You are listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast presented by Veteran Strategies, a local veteran public relations enterprise, and sponsored by Girl Scouts of Central Indiana, Garmond Construction, the Crown Plaza Hotel and Grand Hall and Conference Center at Historic Union Station, the law firm of Bose, McKinney & Evans, and the Bose Public Affairs Group, the McGinley's Golden Ace Inn, and McAllister Machinery, your friendly neighborhood Caterpillar dealer. Thank you for joining us on the Leaders and Legends podcast. Our guest today is basketball wizard and certainly a Hoosier legend, Donnie Walsh. We thank you so much for your time, Donnie. We are thrilled to have you on.
Well, it's good to be with you, and I'm looking forward to the time we spend together.
Well, the first person I need to thank is the wonderful Shannon Walsh, your daughter, who I pinged on mercilessly until she got you to agree to come on. Everyone who knows her knows how wonderful she is, and certainly it's always a treat to see her at the Pacers game. I think she may be the team's number one fan.
Well, she's there every game. I know that, and she used to get on the referees, but I told her, they're starting to know who you are. So, they're going to start looking at me now. So you got to be a little more discreet in what you're saying to them.
Now, I have my family's from the East Coast. My dad's family was born in New Jersey, and my dad moved here after the Marine Corps in the early 60s. And I never really noticed that he had an East Coast accent. But forgive me, Mr. Walsh, I recognize your accent.
Well, to be honest with you, I went from New York when I was just 17 and went to the University of North Carolina. And when I went there, I went with Larry Brown. He came the following year. But I went down there with a Yankee accent. And I left there with a Yankee accent. Larry Brown came down there with a Yankee accent. And within 2 weeks, he had a Southern accent. So I just
was that to try to get girls, or do you think it was genuine?
Well, I thought it was just Larry. He just acclimated immediately. Whereas, to me, I hung on to it and never quite got rid of it.
You and Larry and Coach Brown knew each other in New York City, or you met at North Carolina?
We knew each other in New York City because we played against each other when I was a senior in high school. We didn't come from the same parts of New York, so it wasn't during the high school season. But after the high school season, there were a couple of teams that were developed, and then we'd enter tournaments. He was on one team and I was on the other, and so we played against each other and got to know each other that way.
And do you think that you influenced his decision to go to North Carolina?
No, I don't think so. We were in the same high school class, but he ended up going to prep school, so he was 1 year behind me. But, I think at that time, particularly up in New York, if you got an opportunity to go to North Carolina, you just went. That's where a lot of us wanted to go. And so he was just like me. Once he got the offer, he went there.
And New York basketball in the 50s, early 60s, well, it's always been terrific, but that was a particularly strong time in terms of talent in that area. Would you agree?
I would agree. And I had the opportunity to play with some of the players who were more my age and a little older, but I also had the opportunity to play with the guys that came after us. And, they were really good. I mean, they changed the game. Julius Erving was in that category a little later, but There were some really great players came out of there during that time that, went on to the NBA and all that and were really good players.
Probably the most famous player who came out of New York City is then Lou Alcindor, later Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. When did you meet him?
Well, I knew of him. It's a pretty good story. I was in college, and I was at North Carolina. But when I came home, I had a younger brother who was really a wizard. Like when he was in the third grade and played on the eighth grade team. And so one time when I came back from North Carolina, he and I were talking. Oh, he came in the door and he said, "Well, you played against a big guy today." I said, "Really?" And I'm thinking grammar school, he's probably 5'10" or something. And I said, "Who is that to him?" He said, "Little Louie." I said, "Well, how big is he?" He said, 6'10". And I went, "What?" And then later, he grew up kind of down a hill from where I lived. I used to go down the hill to get my bus and all that to go to school. But he played on a grammar. He grew up in a grammar school area that was fairly close to me. So there were times when he came up to the schoolyard I played in, and I wasn't playing then, but I was in college, and I saw him play in the summer once. I couldn't believe it. I mean, he was so good. He was over 7 feet tall, but when I saw him play, he could play in the back court. He was really, really talented. And I knew his coach, Jack Donahue, who was, a very good coach. And I knew that he had brought him up during the summers to the mountains where he had a camp and just worked with him all the time. And he became, probably one of the best ever to play the game.
Arguably the best college basketball player ever. He went 88-2.
Yeah, you can't take him off the list. That's for sure.
For those who don't know, Lou Alcindor at UCLA went 88-2 and won 3 national championships. And back then it was freshman ineligibility for college athletics or college basketball. And his freshman team routinely beat the UCLA varsity, who had just won multiple national championships in a row.
That's true. I remember that. And he had the opportunity to play for John Wooden, who was obviously from Indiana, but, he had such great coaching along with the great talent that he had that by the time he got to the pros, he was already, heads above most of the players in the league.
Speaking of great coaches, you went to North Carolina to play basketball and played for, quite frankly, a legendary coach in the college ranks named Frank McGuire. What was it like to play with him, play for him, and later on coach with him?
Well, he was, at that time, he had just won the national championship and went 32-0. And that was in 1957, I think. I went there I graduated from high school in 1958. And I went there. So the reason I went there was because of that team and because of Frank McGuire. He might have been the most magnetic man I ever saw in my life. I mean, he just, when he walked in a room, you just automatically knew he was there. And he was a great coach. He had the ability, different than a lot of coaches, and actually different than the second coach I had at North Carolina, Dean Smith, in the sense that you would go in and he would just have you scrimmage all day long. He did some sets and things, that he wanted you to do, but then you just scrimmage, and he would stop the scrimmage and stop it. And so what he did through that process was he got 5 men to play like one, and both offensively and defensively. And he just did it by the force of his own personality in a lot of ways. But he was a guy that, I don't know, he just was so different than anybody else I ever met. And I would say that most of the players at North Carolina thought that way. And, he had been successful at St. John's, at North Carolina. He went into the pros for a year and coached Wilt. and was fairly successful at that. I think he won 49 or 50 games and, lost to the Celtics in a 7-game series, but he was just a different type guy. He could have probably been the governor too. He was that kind of man.
And is my memory correct that in the 57 North Carolina National Basketball Championship team, they beat Wilt Chamberlain and the Kansas Jayhawks in that game?
In the finals. Actually, the last 2 games, the semifinals and the finals, went 3 overtimes, I think, and they won them. And they were undefeated the whole year. So, he had that ability to, if he had good players, good enough players, he was going to win, and he was going to win almost every game.
Your senior season at University of North Carolina featured a new head coach. You mentioned him just a few moments ago. His name is Dean Smith. What was it like not only to have him follow McGuire, but also what I'm going to guess was a lifelong friendship with one of the greatest coaches in the history of sport?
You're right. After you had Frank McGuire, who was like the sun, Dean had been my freshman coach when I went there. He had just come with Frank McGuire, and then he became the head coach in my senior year. So I was around him for 4 years, and you hit it right on the head. Dean Smith was a really, really good man. And as a basketball coach, he was so far ahead of the game that I didn't even understand it in the first couple of times I was around him. I really didn't. He worked on defense a lot with the varsity, and basically some of the things he was telling me I had never heard before, and I had played a lot by that time. And then it just got better. He was where Frank, you scrimmaged a lot with Dean. The practices were timed to the second, and he had a drill for everything, but it all kind of at the end would bleed into whatever he was going to do offensively or defensively. So he was really well thought out coach. And then after I left him and I went to South Carolina, what happened was I went to North Carolina, graduated, and then I became a graduate assistant and went through law school. And then after law school, instead of going into law, I went into basketball. And Frank McGuire hired me at South Carolina, so I went down there. But I thought he was fabulous, to tell you the truth. And he was a better man than he was a coach. And he was a great, great coach.
And probably, would it be fair to say, before we move on, the greatest recruiter in the history of college basketball, given the talent he accumulated over the decades at North Carolina?
He was. I mean, he ended up getting great, great players. And then he had, his teams reflected that, though. I mean, on one team, he had Michael Jordan and Sam Perkins and a myriad of other players on the team that were that good. So it really was something to watch him as he kept going.
Yeah, I don't know that this podcast is long enough to list all of the first-round draft picks who played for Dean Smith. I think that the 83-84 team that Indiana famously beat, I think in the Sweet 16, had 4 or 5 number 1 draft picks on the roster. And IU's lone number 1 draft pick was Uwe Blop.
Yeah, no, you're right. It was a great team. And I think they won the championship somewhere in there. I forget when it was. But I was happy to see Dean win it because, Frank had won one at 32-0, and then Dean came back and won it, somewhere in his first, I'd say, 6 or 7 or 8 years.
You mentioned turning down law firms and a career in law to stay with basketball. Why was it so powerful, such a powerful pull on your life that you maybe turned down opportunity to work at some of the most prestigious law firms in the biggest city in the world because you wanted to coach basketball at North Carolina and South Carolina?
I don't know that I could explain that. I just remember that I had a job interview with a law firm, Nixon Mudge, and it went on forever. Mitchell and it was on Wall Street. So they had already offered me a job, so I had to go there, and I met all the partners on this trip. And then the last guy I met was Nixon, and after I finished with him, they were taking me to the elevator, and they walked me through the law library. And when I was walking through the library with this guy, I looked around, and all the guys my age were sitting there at these big benches with books up to the ceiling. And I thought, I don't know if I want to do this for the rest of my life. And by the time I got to the elevator, I thought, I'm not going to do this. And so I basically went back, and Dean hired me to begin with as an assistant coach. And then Frank called him up about 2 or 3 months later and asked Dean if I could go to South Carolina because he had lost his assistant. So that's what happened.
Talk a little bit just for a second, because as we jump to your pro career, the differences between pro basketball players, college basketball players back then, it seems like that the distinction isn't as distinct now as it was in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. Did you really enjoy college basketball more, or the pro, or were there just positives and negatives to each?
Well, I enjoyed college basketball a lot. I really did. And I didn't think that I was going to, and actually what I thought was that the coaching on the college level wouldn't be on the pro level, wouldn't be like the coaching in the college level. But I thought, because I thought someday I wanted to be an administrator. That's when I was thinking of going to the pros. I wanted to be an administrator, and I thought that after what I observed was that the administration in college was better at that time than the administration in the pros. Well, I was wrong. Once I got into the NBA and was coaching, I thought all the coaches were like really good, really good, because their game was broken down into smaller segments where you had to make decisions that really affected the game. And they were expert at it. They knew the clock, the time, everything. And they knew when they wanted to do something and when it wasn't working, and they would change up. And, their timeouts were really good. Now, I was with Larry Brown in the pros my first year. So he's about as good a coach as you could ever get. And particularly when he was in the pros, I remember thinking, because I played with Larry, thinking, well, I wonder what makes him a good pro coach, because, we came from the same background and all that. And I found out on the first day, I looked at him, and he was constantly going over fundamentals with the players. Now, these are pros. And when we got through the first practice, I thought, now I know why he's as good as he is, because he was very adamant that everything had to be fundamentally right.
Was it at this time, and I hate to bring up probably one of your most famous quotes, Donnie Walsh once said of Larry Brown, he's only happy when he's unhappy.
That's right. That's exactly right.
Did you realize that in North Carolina or later?
I think I realized it just knowing Larry, and it's a little overstated in a certain sense. I mean, you have to know what I mean. Larry is a terrific guy, but when he's coaching, he's never happy. I mean, he's not, and you could play the greatest game you ever saw, and basically Larry would have something wrong with it, and he'd commiserate about it. He'd be upset about it. And so people around him thought, well, this guy's crazy. And I said, no. You got to understand, Larry's only happy when he's unhappy. So, because I didn't think people got him, because I really liked him a lot. We were very close friends. But I knew he had a funny effect on the people who didn't quite know him. So I always used to explain him that way. Well, you just got to know him. And the only other guy that's like that is Doug Moe, who understood him like I did.
That's right. That's right. But Coach Brown always looked tortured on the sideline, like
He is.
tortured.
That's what I mean. But but he was so into the game, and then remains that way right now. And he's not coaching. He has to be in misery because Larry is everything. He sees himself as a coach, and he loves coaching. He wants to coach, and so when he's coaching, he's so intense that it's something to watch. And I watched it on a daily basis for about 2 or 3 years, and then when he came here, another 4. But I think he's a great coach.
He's terrific. He's won a national championship. I believe he won one with Kansas with Danny Manning, and then didn't he go on to win an NBA championship?
Yeah, with Detroit.
With Detroit, yeah.
And he always. The thing that Larry could do is come into a team that was, let's say, good or not great, but good, and immediately you were better. I mean, just immediately. And he did that for us with the Pacers. He came in, and we had really advanced in the playoffs a lot. We were always getting in it, but getting knocked out in the first round. And his first year, we go to the Eastern Conference Finals, and then second year we go to the Eastern Conference Finals. So I mean, he was just terrific coach.
Recently we had former Purdue coach Gene Cady on the podcast. He was warm and engaging and generous and terrific, and it was an amazing honor to speak with him. One of the things I asked him, he grew up in Kansas and then matriculated to Indiana, actually through Kentucky and then Indiana. Here you are, New York City, go to North Carolina, and then you end up in Indiana. I asked Coach Cady about the hotbeds of basketball that were the states that he worked and lived in. Let me ask you the same question. New York City, North Carolina, and then eventually Indiana. How would you rate Indiana's love of basketball compared to those other states? And was it a joy to work in an environment where the game is so beloved?
Yeah, it was. And I was lucky. I grew up in New York where the game, but there's a difference between all three. I grew up in New York where everybody, because if you think about it, there aren't a lot of baseball fields in New York that kids can go out and play in, and football, same thing. But everybody, there's basketball courts all over the city. So it became, at least on high school and below level, a city game. I mean, everybody plays basketball in New York. So you get the love of the game through playing it and all that in New York. You really do. And then I went to North Carolina, where it was the ACC at that time was like World War III. I mean, every school went after it. There were a lot of good teams. The play was really good. But what really differentiated with the fans were, I mean, just berserk. If you were a Duke graduate and you rooted for Duke, you couldn't even talk to a guy from North Carolina the day of the game. I mean, it really was. It was very intense, and you ended up with a tournament at the end of the year. No matter how good you did in those days, no matter how good you did during the regular season, all it did was seeded you for the tournament. If you didn't win the tournament, you didn't get in the NCAA.
And that's what I was getting ready to ask you about that. That's back when the NCAA was, I think, 32 teams, and so many terrific teams never actually made it to the tournament based on the low number of folks who actually got to participate in the tournament. But you mentioned great teams, and we're going to go back for just a second. I would like you to please talk about one that you, I'm assuming, witnessed firsthand, and then I know you ended up coaching one of its players. And that was the 1973-74 North Carolina State team that had Tom Burleson and the all-time sky jumper David Thompson, who actually beat UCLA and ended their NCAA championship winning streak. What was it like to see that particular team in action?
Well, it was something because they had a good team, but they had, what today is a little more regular. They had the one athlete that it was way above everybody else, and that was David Thompson. I mean, David Thompson was doing Michael Jordan type stuff back then. Michael probably was better, which is hard to believe in a lot of ways for somebody who was around David. But David was really a phenomenal player, and so that's what differentiated them from everybody else during that time. And they were terrific to watch. I think I saw them play against Marquette or somebody, and who had a really good team, and they had great athletes on the team. And David was up above all of them. I mean, it was really something to watch.
You also probably witnessed one way or another the 75-76 IU national championship team that went 32-0. What were your impressions of that team, if you can remember it very well?
Well, I had met Bobby Knight with Dean Smith on we got like an all-star game where you go to recruit players and all, and so they were friendly, and I got to know Bobby through that. But then when Bobby had that team, I remember being in New York, I think it was, and watching him in person, and I thought his coaching was really good, and particularly the players he had fit right into what he was doing, and so knowing his personality, and he had a great mind for the game, as good as anybody, and I thought they were great. They were a lot of good players, but they played completely together as a team. They just had all the parts that you need to have a chance to be a championship team.
When you see two people you know, and one you know really well, and I'm assuming one you know pretty well, and that is, for example, 1981, March 30th, IU plays North Carolina in the national championship game. The day is also infamous for President Reagan being shot. What was it like when you would see friends of yours in the coaching community or the basketball community play each other in the ultimate prize high stakes game? Is it just tough because you know someone that you really like is going to be hurting the next day?
Yeah, because, and it's for another reason, really. It's because you know both people. You know they're both great coaches. You know only one can come out victorious. And so you kind of know that it's going to be the way the ball bounces in that game. And so that's kind of how I felt about those games. But it was because you had two great coaches.
One last question before we move on. What do you think of, because he was just on the podcast, and like I said, he was just terrific, especially kind to me and a lifelong IU fan who's never rooted for Purdue to win anything. Yet Coach Katie came on and was terrific. What do you think of Coach Katie's tenure at Purdue to come into the Big Ten? I think his first year at the Big Ten was the year IU won the national championship with Isaiah Thomas. And for him to have what is probably next to Knight and Tom Izzo, the best run of coaching in the Big Ten in the modern era.
Well, you know, I watched his teams play, and I got to know Gene. I really liked him as a guy. And he had a toughness to him that I thought his teams had. You know, they got it from him. And I don't care what kind of team he had in any one year, he was going to be difficult to beat. And the thing that amazed me about Gene was something I read. I didn't really ever talk to him about it, but he was a football player who became a great basketball coach. And I always wanted to talk to him about that, but I never really got the opportunity to do it. How did he pick it up? You know,
he talked about that on the podcast. I'll send you the link. He talked a lot about football, and you can see that toughness. Speaking of someone who looked miserable on the sideline, he always had something to say, and he needed that sort of toughness because he entered the Big Ten's coaching ranks really at almost the Big Ten's peak and competed as well or better than anyone.
Yeah, I think that's true, and I know it came from football, but basketball and football are somewhat different in the sense that basketball is you can't program each play. You know what I mean? You've got to
Right.
kind of have a flexibility to read the defense and to when you see them guarding the play that you just ran and you don't have the shot, you got to know what to do. And usually there are definite things you can go to. Whereas in football, it's more programmed. You run a play and it either works or it doesn't work. Now there are some in the pros. There are some guys that can make it work when it didn't work, but usually in college you don't see that. But I just thought it was a different mentality. But he was able to perform in both areas, so I was always impressed by that.
You
And
are
he has a
listening to
great-
Leaders and Legends, a podcast presented by Veteran Strategies, a local veteran public relations enterprise, and sponsored by Girl Scouts of Central Indiana, Garmond Construction, the Crown Plaza Hotel and Grand Hall and Conference Center at historic Union Station, the law firm of Bose, McKinney, and Evans, and the Bose Public Affairs Group, the McGinley's Golden Ace Inn, and McAllister Machinery, your friendly neighborhood Caterpillar dealer. Our guest on the Leaders and Legends podcast today is famous basketball wizard and leader without peer, Donnie Walsh. Donnie, let me ask you a quick question. Is there a Hoosier legend or leader you particularly admire?
Well, politically, Senator Lugar to me, and I've been at different states, grew up in a different area, went to school in a different area, coached in different areas. Senator Lugar to me was the best. He was a senator, but politician that I ever saw. I thought he was fabulous in every area, and I always had a great deal of admiration for him.
We were lucky enough several months ago to do a podcast with Jim Shella and Gail Lowry and someone you know very well, a man named Jim Morris, that talked about the career of Richard Lugar and the impact he had on this state.
Well, he represented the state and the country so well it was hard to believe. I thought he was very well spoken. You could tell he was a very moral man. He was doing the job for the right reasons. I just really had a lot of admiration for him.
In the late 70s, you make the jump to the pro ranks, hired by Larry Brown, and then you end up coaching the team, the Denver Nuggets, for a year. Speaking of a collection of talent, I looked up the roster for the Nuggets for that year you coached. George McGinnis, Alex English, Dan Issel, David Thompson. What was it like to coach such an amazing array of talent? I think there's at least 2 or 3 Hall of Famers on the list that I just read.
Yeah, I enjoyed coaching the NBA players, and I learned a lot from the NBA players a couple of years before that when I first came into it with Larry, because the pro game is completely different than the college game. But it isn't because you just give them the ball and let them do what they want to do. Basically, it's different because the skill levels, the talent, the knowledge is all way up there. And so they know if something's going to work or it's not going to work. They knew before the coach knew in many times. And so I would talk to them about those things. And I learned a lot from talking to them what the difference was between college and pro. And there is a big difference. But it was enjoyable. I liked George McGinnis a lot. He was a good man. David Thompson, I thought, was one of the most talented guys up until Michael came in the league. He was somewhat like Michael, not maybe as well-rounded as Michael, but he had that kind of talent. And he was fundamentally a good player, too. And Alex English, I basically traded George, or I was involved in the trade that sent George back here to Indiana and Alex to us. And I had coached Alex in South Carolina. So I really felt comfortable with that trade. And it worked out really well because he became one of the highest scorers in pro history.
And that was a great era of, is it fair to say that that time period, that era of NBA wasn't necessarily known for its defense because you had just an array of terrific scorers: David Thompson, George Gervin, Alex English. The list goes on, Pete Maravich, of people who could just light it up and go for 50 or more nightly.
Exactly. And there were other players. There were a lot of other players in the league at the same time. I mean, it was a really talented, it was a big jump up in talent. Because, as you know, the college had talent too, because in those days, it wasn't easy to go from, like if you were a junior or something, to go from college to the pros like as a junior or a sophomore or something. Now the young guys are doing it as freshmen. You didn't have a lot of that. There were maybe one or two that had hardship, which is the only way you could do it. But the pros were just, you know, they had played so many games. They were men, and that made a big difference. They were men. They knew how to use their bodies. They knew how to get their bodies ready to play. You know, they could play very physically and not get hurt. It was phenomenal difference. But I enjoyed that a lot, and the more I got into it and was into it, and that lasted a long time, I really loved it. I think it's the highest level of basketball that is in this world right now.
Let me make a statement, and you just say whether it's true or false, or whether you agree or disagree. We talked about the era in basketball in which you were coaching in the Nuggets. The NBA was pretty well documented at its nadir. The NBA finals were shown on tape delay and various other aspects of the fact that the game just wasn't doing well. So the statement I'm going to make, and you please address it. The NBA was saved by the arrival of Magic Johnson and Larry Bird.
And David Stern, I would say.
And David Stern. That's true. David Stern.
Right. Because there's no doubt that Larry and Magic had a gigantic influence on the game. But what David did is he took a league that was a regional league. If you think about it, one was on one coast and the other on the other coast. And he turned it into, first of all, by adding franchises in different cities, he made it a national game. And then after he made it a national game, he made it an international game. But I would say this, he was not the commissioner that long before Larry and Magic came in the league. And they did, because he had one on one coast and the other on the other coast. And they were phenomenal. I mean, I remember the first time I saw Magic, we were playing him in an exhibition game. And you didn't realize how big this guy was. I mean, he was 6'8", 6'9", with a big body. And yet and in those days, a guy like that couldn't play point guard. And he was a point guard. I can remember one of our players coming over to me in the exhibition game and saying, "Donnie, I think this Magic's going to be really good." I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "He's like a power forward coming down at you. And he's a point guard."
When did
I would agree.
When did you first become aware of Larry Bird as a player?
Well, I saw him play in college, and I could tell he was really good. But when I got into the pros and saw him in the pros, I thought he was phenomenal. I still think he's, you know, it's hard to pick the best player and all that. But to me, Larry could do everything. And then on top of that, he was brilliant as a player. He knew exactly what play to make at the right time, whether it be a pass getting a rebound. He knew when the important things were there, and he had every skill. You know, guys can get into the NBA on one skill. Larry had 10 skills, I thought. You know, it was nothing he couldn't do. And he always did it at the right time. You know, if he threw the ball behind his ear or something, it was the right play. It wasn't just to look good. And he did everything in a split second. And so he was an unusual combination. And as I said, Magic was somewhat the same. So that was an ideal rivalry. And yet, as it developed, I don't know about it initially, it was a very respectful rivalry. Both guys respected each other, and that bore well for the NBA that it was like that. No matter how hard they played and hit each other and all that, that was there.
In 1984, you come to the Pacers as an assistant coach. And then coach, I believe, was George Irvine. And
yes.
So you've stayed in basketball all these years, turned down law firms and making money through your law degree. Before we get into your Pacer years, which will take up the bulk of the rest of the podcast, was there ever any point that you regretted it and was like, oh, shoot, I should have done X instead of Y?
Well, I also had 5 children. So, yeah, I mean, there were a lot of moments where I worried about it because, you know, it's a hit or miss situation as a job opportunity. But I tell you the truth, with Indiana, way back when I was at South Carolina, I can remember reading, because I did a lot of reading back then, you know, in sports magazines and that type of thing. And I kept reading about Indiana. I kept reading about, well, the basketball, you know, what you mentioned, the Hoosier game and all that kind of stuff. And in particular, the high school tournament, which, you know, was on class. Any class could play against each other and meet each other in the finals. So that was unusual. And I had a guy that worked with us at South Carolina who scouted, and he told me about how unbelievable it was. So right away, I had this kind of thing in my head. I'd love to see what that place is like. And then I started reading about people in other areas, you know, Kurt Vonnegut and people like that. Or watch TV and Florence Henderson from Indiana. I'm thinking, God, there are a lot of really cool people from Indiana. And then when George asked me to come out here, I was really, really up to try to see what it was all about. And obviously I enjoyed it. I've been here for, I guess, 30 years, more than that. 40 maybe.
Was it always one of your goals to be in management? You eventually became, after assistant coach of the Pacers, became the general manager. Is that something that you wanted to do, or were you torn between staying on the bench and moving to the front office?
No, at a certain point when I was in South Carolina, it was right at the end, and I actually left there with I was taking the bar exam 13 years after I went to law school. And I remember I was in the course, the bar course, to get ready for it. And Larry Brown called me up and basically said, Donnie, you want to come out and be my assistant? And I had already made my mind up. I was going to try to go into law. But the minute he said it, I went, yeah. So I went out and I met with him. And at that time, I told Larry and I told Carl Scheer, who was the general manager at that time, I don't want to stay as a coach. I want to have an opportunity to be a general manager someday. Because when I really thought about it, I thought that my talents laid in a lot of different things about basketball. And when I analyze coaches, the best coaches are the guys that there's one way to play, this is the way it is, and they get a team to play that way. I knew 10 ways to play, and so I didn't think it benefited me as a coach. And so I was really in the back of my mind thinking about I would love to become a general manager. So that basically is what my thought was when I came into the pros. And I didn't have the opportunity in Denver, although if I had stayed there, I might have had an opportunity. But then when George asked me to come down here as a coach, the Simons gave me that opportunity. And I really loved working for them. I really loved being a general manager at that, and then the later president and all that. But it was more. It was suited. I was suited more for that than I was coaching.
You came to the Pacers when they were struggling a bit as a franchise. They hadn't done very well, and infamously had to have a telethon to even save the team before the Pacers were sold to the Simon brothers. But the Pacers had a terrific run in the ABA. What did you, as someone who understands the game of basketball, understands talent, what did you think of the ABA versus the NBA in those kind of early to mid 70s years?
Well, I knew they had a lot of really good players because when they opened the league up, they were competing with the NBA, and the only way for them to get the best players was to offer them a lot of money. So it got to be known that, like, some of these great players coming out of college, if they had their choice, they would probably go to the ABA teams. And I think that's what I thought of the league. I thought it was a really, really talented league. I thought that, on the other part of it, the backing and all that wasn't as good as the NBA. And the NBA actually got a lot better. But so I noticed that, like, the ABA lost teams as it went on, which meant a lot of teams weren't making it. But I knew this because, I had players that I coached in college that played in the league. And so they would come back and talk to me about the players in the league. And I had played with Roger Brown. I knew how good he was. I knew a lot of the players that were in the ABA, and I knew they were great players. And so the way it turned out, at least in my mind, was that when the ABA disbanded and the players were coming into the NBA, I thought that was the biggest change for the NBA of anything, really. Because if you look, and somebody told me this, but then I tried to check it out, and I think it's true, that the next year after the ABA players came into the NBA, 12 or 13 of the All-Stars were from the ABA.
That's an incredibly high number.
Yeah. So I think that really helped the league a lot, the NBA.
The Pacers won the ABA championship in 1970 and again in 72 and in 73. The NBA champion for those years were 1970 the Knicks, 1972 the Lakers, and 1973 the Knicks again. What do you think the Pacers would have done in a matchup with these teams that are some of the greatest NBA teams of all time?
I think it would have been very competitive, and that they had a chance to beat them because they were that good. I mean, they had Mel Daniels, who was a great player and a great center, which is important. They had George, who was really good. They had Nedelicki, who I guess backed him up. And then they had Roger Brown, who was a great player. They had guards like Billy Keller, who could really shoot the ball, and Freddie Carter, I guess. That was a great player. So, and I knew this because I had guys that were playing in the league. In fact, Kevin Joyce, who I coached, was here for a year. But I also knew guys who were on other teams. And so, they'd come up to me and say, "Hey, Donnie, you play with that guy Roger Brown?" I said, "Yeah, in high school I played with him." And they said, "Well, now when I played with Roger, he was a great shooter and a great jumper. I mean, he could jump out of the gym." So they said, "He's got more moves than they were almost talking like he was Oscar Robertson." And I'm saying, well, so I saw Roger when I first came back here, and I happened to have seen the film they had on the ABA team, their ABA team. And I saw where Roger he had more moves than anybody. So when I saw Roger, he was up in the gym one day. And I went up there and I said, "Hey, Roger, when I knew you, you were a jumper and a shooter. Where did you get all that stuff?" And he laughed. He said, "Yeah, you did know when I could jump." He said, "Well, he said, the year I was out of basketball, I went and I just studied films of Oscar, Jerry West. I just got films of them and studied and copied their moves, and he copied them real well. he was that good."
When you're the general man, go ahead.
That was a terrific team. I mean, I don't care what league they were in. They were a great team, and they had Slick Leonard, who I've always admired as a coach. When I came in the league, Slick was a guy that would, meet you and treat you nicely, and let you know, "Oh, you're in it, buddy," and that kind of stuff. He was terrific. I liked him a lot.
When you're the general manager of a professional team, how much do you take into account what the fans want or what you think is the best move to grow or increase the fan base? I'm referencing, of course, the decision in 1987 to draft Reggie Miller over Steve Alford. I was in the Army at the time, so I wasn't here during the draft, but I remember reading about just what a huge groundswell and pressure that you perhaps felt to choose the Newcastle guard who had just led Indiana to a national championship. Is your thought process, it's what's best for the team, who's the best player, or is there some aspect of, well, if we draft this guy, he may not be as good as the other guy, but it'll put butts in seats?
Well, I would say this. For me personally, I would always take the player that was best for the team, because in the long run, it's going to put people in the seats if you do the right thing. Even in the short run, if you do things for the wrong reason, they just don't work. And the truth is, as much as people, and I'm not talking about Indiana specifically here, but if you, let's say, draft a guy and bring him in just because he's, from that area, and it doesn't work, he will get treated terribly. I can tell you that.
That's a true point.
So, I always felt like you only have one choice as a GM, and that is to take the best player for your team. And I thought Steve was a great college shooter, actually, but I thought he didn't have a real NBA game in the sense that he was a 6'1" two guard, and he really wasn't at his best as a point guard. But I did tell him one time I thought he'd be a great coach someday. And I'm glad that he got that opportunity and proved it.
Did you ever get a sense of self-vindication as Miller's career continued to grow and blossom, eventually becoming a Hall of Famer? Not that you were beating your own chest. In other words, hey, I'm the expert here. Just listen to me. I'll do okay. But just like, you know what? We took the guy who may not have been a popular choice here in Indiana, but look how he turned out, not only on the court, but off the court.
Well, I was happy about that. I can't argue that point. But I wasn't beating my chest or anything. I was happy that it worked and that Reggie did become beyond even what I thought he was going to become. And they did integrate himself into the culture of this city, which he did really well. But I never really, once he was here, I basically felt fortunate that we had him because he was winning the games. I mean, and I don't mean all by himself, but he was the guy that at the end of the game, throwing the ball, he shot it and went in the whole time. So it really worked for us as a team, and and it helped us get further up in the standings and then further up in the playoffs to the point where we were a contending team for quite a while.
Perhaps Reggie Miller's most famous shot, and I'm going to also ask you about what happened at in Madison Square Garden, but Miller's most famous shot was the one he hit over Michael Jordan in the playoffs against Chicago. Bird famously, then coach Larry Bird famously didn't have his expression change at all as everyone in the arena went crazy. What was your reaction to that shot?
Well, I was, I knew, I saw it, the play we were in. I saw Reggie run out to the top. I saw Michael was going to grab him, and Reggie gave him a quick push. And then I looked, and Reggie was all by himself. And, I hate to say this, but when I ever saw him take a shot with nobody guarding him, I almost counted the points before they went on the board, before the ball went in. Because I just knew after a while, that was fairly into his career. I knew he's not going to miss the shot, and he didn't. But what people forget is that there was 0.6 of a second left, and Michael Jordan, I was under the basket that he shot at. That ball, to me, when he shot it at the end of the game, I thought, oh, my God, that's in. And it rattled around the rim and went out. So, good fortune goes both ways.
We have ancillary helpers on this show. We have supporters of the Leaders and Legends podcast who I reach out to when we're going to have people on, and I ask them to help me come up with questions or maybe give me a little nugget of information. So the absolutely wonderful and amazing and one of the greatest people I've ever met is a guy named Bill Benner.
Oh,
and
Bill,
I asked him, I told him you were coming on, and I asked Bill for some thoughts. And he sent me a note, and he said, quote, make sure you ask Donnie about what he did right before Reggie went for 8 points in 9 seconds in the Garden.
Oh, yeah, I'm the one who told the story. So, well, during that game, that was the first game of the series, and we were up there because they had a better record than we did. And we had played them really close the year before, I believe. So anyhow, when I'm sitting there at the end of toward the end of the fourth quarter, it's about a minute and something to go. And we're down by 8 points. I think the game's over. So I am mad, and I didn't get mad at the players. I'm just mad that we didn't play better and we were going to lose. And so I walk out of the arena, out of the seating area, and go in the tunnel and go into the locker room. And it was an open locker room, though. It wasn't our locker room. So I went in there and I shut the door. And I'm just walking around and kind of talking to myself. All of a sudden, a knock comes at the door. And I'm not in a good mood. So it ends up being Mel Daniels. He goes, hey, Donnie. I said, Mel, don't give me anything. I don't want to talk to you. I'm not very in good mood. And he kept it up, and I got mad. So I ran to the door. I said, what do you want? He said, Reggie just tied the game. And I said, yeah, Mel, don't fool with me. So he said, come here. And so we walked down to an area where there were some guys watching a television set. And so I walk in the room, and I look at the TV set, and Reggie's on the foul line, and I'm starting to get my bearings now. Mel just told me this was tied. And now Reggie's on the foul. So I said, no, are you telling me that if Reggie makes these free throws, we're going to be up? And he said, yeah. I was in disbelief. I couldn't believe it. And then, obviously I went back and looked at all that and thought, holy cow, what a sequence I missed here.
Now, I have to ask this. Reggie Miller is one of the all-time famous trash talkers. So did he ever talk a little smack about you walking down the tunnel and not watching it?
Never. Never said a word to me.
I'll have to get word to Reggie through our good friend and fellow Hal Hornet, Russ Tuttle, whose security helped make the Pacers the team that it is. Isn't that right, Mr. Walsh?
Definitely.
We would love to have Reggie Miller on the podcast so we could ask about
Reggie.
it himself.
Reggie knows that I may have walked out, but I was the happiest guy in the whole place when I walked out of the Madison Square Garden that night.
Well, and that was one thing I wanted to ask you real quick. Did you grow up a Knicks fan? And if so, what was it like for you? Obviously, you were blue and gold, but to see your Pacers go up against the Knicks for all those classic series in the 90s.
Well, it was great not because I'm from New York and all that, but because we were always trying to get further up the line in the regular season and then to do well in the playoffs. And the Knicks were always the team that at least in my mind, we had to beat in order to keep going. And the first time we went up there, I think we lost a 7-game series. And that was the second time. And so in that one, we won the game. And so it was the kind of mark of excellence. They had Riley as the coach. They had a lot of good players. They were a good team. And I thought we were a good team. And so for 2 or 3, maybe more years, we battled them and got our wins and got further along and became a Final Four team quite a few times during that period. 6 times, I think, during my period. Then later, Larry put a team together that made it twice to the Final Four, what I call Final Four.
2 quick questions about.
I knew we had to beat New York. I knew we had to beat New York to go further, so I always wanted to beat them. And that is key joy. There may be little joys, but that is.
What made you think Larry Bird was going to be such a successful coach, which he clearly was? And 2, when Bird was a player and you were a general manager for the Pacers, did you ever try to trade for him, bring the home state guy home?
One time, because the guy, it wasn't Ned Auerbach, it was another guy, was calling me up all the time and saying, he wanted to get a couple of our players. And I said, okay, give me Larry Bird and I'll do it. And he couldn't do it. And it was later in Larry's career, but he wouldn't do it. That was the only time. But I didn't think I didn't know if we would do it. I'm pretty sure we would have. But I just wanted to see if he was, just trying to get a couple of players I had for a cheap price. And so I found out, well, he's not going to give Larry, so if there's no one else I want, I'm not going to do this. But anyhow, what was the second question?
What made you think that Larry Bird was going to be such a terrific coach?
I'll be honest. I thought he would just from watching him, and I didn't know him that well then. But I talked to enough people that knew him, and I knew he was a smart guy. But he came down here to meet with me and Herb. And I had already been up there, and I met with him down here for a couple of days. And one of the days, we were in a little conference room, and I said, Larry, okay, if you take this job, can you tell me how you're going to coach this team? And he took me from the first day of training camp to the finals. And I mean in detail about what he would do. The first thing that jumped into my mind, he said, well, before I got to the first game, I would go out, and Donnie, I've never coached, so I would hire 2 really good assistants, which turned out to be Rick Carlisle and Dick Carter, who was a great, great defensive coach. So I knew right then, oh, okay, this guy's for real. But after listening to him, he went in detail about how he would coach the team, what he would do, all the way from game 1 all the way to the finals of the NBA. It took about an hour and a half, 2 hours. I have never had anybody do anything like that with me. So when I walked out of the room that time, I knew this guy's going to be great. And he was.
Let me ask you a quick question about 1991, the playoffs. What was it like to watch Bird and Chuck Person go at each other, both with their game and with their mouths? Well,
Chuck knows I would say this. There was never a day when he could out-talk Larry Bird, that's for sure. But he did. He tried. And I think Larry respected that. Larry respected Chuck because he really tried to play hard against him. But he did it his whole career. I mean, from the first game he played against Larry, he was trying out. But Larry was just one of those guys. It was very difficult to outplay him. And Chuck knew that. I remember Chuck coming up to me, and this is true, too. And he said, Donnie Walsh. I said, yeah, what's up, Chuck? He said, they got Larry Bird listed at 6'9". And he said, I'm telling you, Donnie, he's at least 7 feet tall. And I think he's right. I think he was right. The Chuck was about 6'8" or 6'9", but Larry always looked so much bigger than him.
We're going to.
But one thing, they could both shoot the ball, and they're both competitive guys. And Larry was Larry. What can I tell you?
Was it ever frustrating to have so many Celtics fans at Pacers games, or when Jordan would come with the Bulls, to have so many Bulls fans come down? And did that ever get on your nerves, for lack of a better term, as a member of the Pacers organization?
Absolutely, and I always took it as a failure of some kind on my part, that we didn't do better to have the whole place sold out all the time. But it used to irk me a little bit.
Donnie Walsh's tenure as general manager of the Pacers.
But we needed the money too,
Donnie Walsh's tenure as general manager of the Pacers resulted in the Pacers making the playoffs 17 times, the Eastern Conference Finals 6 times, the NBA Finals once, and were Central Division champions 4 times. And for those of us who are old enough both to remember the ABA glory days, barely in my case, but certainly those years of futility in the late 70s through the mid to late 80s, Donnie Walsh's arrival, along, of course, with Larry Brown and the terrific collection of talent they assembled together, really led to a renaissance of pro basketball here in Indianapolis. We thank you very much for that. But I want to ask you one more question before we end with the 5 questions we ask of everyone on the show. This was just brought to my attention, you have, of course, over your career and lifetime, met and interacted with famous celebrities, of course, and athletes, basketball players, you name it. But you recently were in the Indianapolis Star because of your connection to a brand new, sort of different type of celebrity. Do you know to whom I'm referring? And can you talk to us a little bit about that?
Well,
he's on TV next to the president almost every day.
Oh, okay, yeah. Well, yeah, I got a phone call from the Wall Street Journal, and the guy called me up, and I thought he was going to talk to me about pro basketball. And I said, well, I'm not a spokesman for our team today, so I don't. He said, no, I don't want to talk to you about our team today, your team today. I want to talk to you about high school. And I said, oh, high school? Now, I would just tell you this. I was a senior in high school 63 years ago. So he picks out a team. He said, you played against Regis High School in New York. And I went, yeah, they're a Jesuit school. We're a Jesuit school. We usually played them. And then he said to me, well, did you know that Dr. Fauci played on that team? And now I'm trying to remember playing Regis, which I couldn't remember at all for whatever reason, because I can remember some of the teams, and I could not remember Dr. Fauci. I'm thinking of his face today, trying to think. I don't remember a guy that looked like that, but he's as old as I am, so why would he look like that? So then I couldn't remember anything about it, and then he said at the end of it, he said, and they beat you. That I definitely didn't remember. So now I'm running around, picking up iPad and all that stuff, trying to look up to see if I can find that game, which I doubt I could ever find it. But I accepted it. He told me we lost, and that Dr. Fauci, I have no idea how I played, but I remember after after he said that, I went, they beat us? And then I thought to myself, you must have been bad in that game. I couldn't imagine that could have happened. But in any case, I have a lot of admiration for the doctor today. I can't remember him from back then, but today I have a lot of it. In fact, I've looked it up, and he played with a guy that played high school with me. I've been trying to reach the guy to say, hey, tell me about this game.
Well, I'm pretty sure we could do an entire podcast on the 6 degrees of Donnie Walsh and the people you've coached, played with, interacted, helped. You've definitely made your mark, left your mark over your lifetime. This connection to Fauci is so incredible. I just had to bring it up. I appreciate you addressing it.
It kind of shocked me. But then, none of us that are, in professional athletics, and particularly those of us who have played at some level, the minute you say something, so-and-so beat you, it's like a challenge. It went right through me for a minute. And then I realized, I said, well, I'm glad he's doing what he's doing now, where I'm sitting home watching him do it, and it looks like it's working. So he must have something going for him.
You are listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast presented by Veteran Strategies, a local veteran public relations enterprise, and sponsored by Girl Scouts of Central Indiana, Garmond Construction, the Crown Plaza Hotel and Grand Hall and Conference Center at historic Union Station, the law firm of Bose, McKinney & Evans, and the Bose Public Affairs Group, the McGinley's Golden Ace Inn, and McAllister Machinery, your friendly neighborhood Caterpillar dealer. Donnie, we close the podcast with the same 5 questions to everyone. And if you're ready, I will go ahead.
Okay.
What was your first job?
My first job. Boy, that's taking me back. I was a wire lapper, which was a construction job. That was one of my first jobs. And then I also worked in the New York. It was a utility company in New York that basically set up the Great Lakes and brought electricity from the Great Lakes to New York. But it was a legal part of that.
Really?
Yeah.
Well, that's certainly that's definitely a unique answer for your first job. What was your first concert?
My first concert. It had to be Elvis Presley. I'll tell you that. I think it was. I think he was the first one. I went with our team to Vegas, and he was performing there, and Frank got us tickets, and we all went and saw Elvis sing. It was something else, because that was when he was really good.
If you could recommend any book for someone to read, which book would you suggest?
Oh, well, I have a lot of books, but 7-Story Mountain by Thomas Merton.
The Catholic philosopher?
Yes.
Number 4, if you could witness any event in history, which event would you choose? Be there as it happens.
Probably would be a heavyweight fight, and probably would involve Muhammad Ali.
The first Ali Frazier fight, perhaps?
Yeah, I would love to go into that.
Last question. If you could have dinner with anyone in the world living today, 2 hours off the record, whom would you choose?
Well, you said living because I had some others, but living today, I have a lot of them that I'd love to have dinner with, but I don't know. I really can't pick somebody out now. I would have said John Kennedy in my younger years, but
a very popular answer has been Larry Bird. but I'm sure you've already done that.
Yeah, I've done that. So, and I would have picked him out years ago. I would have.
Donnie Walsh has been our guest on the Leaders and Legends podcast. We are very, very grateful for your time. We appreciate all the stories. And not only that, the impact that you and your family have had on not only the city of Indianapolis, the state of Indiana, but also the impact you've had on our culture and our love of basketball. Thank you so much, sir, for coming on.
Well, thank you. I enjoyed it, Robert, and I enjoyed it very much.
Thank you very much for listening to Leaders and Legends, brought to you by Veteran Strategies Incorporated. If you want to contact us about this program or our menu of public relations services, please send us an email at robert@veteranstrategies.com. That's robert@veteranstrategies.com.